One glance across the room, and Catherine's world tilted. What had she just seen? The Windsor luncheon had begun like so many others, polished, rehearsed, and perfectly staged. The royal calendar dictated every moment, and everyone played their part without faltering. But today felt different, and Catherine felt it in her bones. As she stood in quiet conversation with a senior courtier, her eyes kept drifting toward the side salon where the younger royals had been gathered. There, amidst polite laughter and clinking teacups, she noticed Charlotte. Usually lively and full of quiet mischief, her daughter now sat motionless, her small hands folded neatly in her lap as though she were trying to disappear. Catherine's instincts bristled. She knew her daughter, knew the tilt of her chin when she was proud, the sparkle in her eye when she was playful, and the telltale sigh when boredom crept in. But this was none of those. Charlotte's shoulders were drawn inward, her gaze fixed somewhere between the tablecloth and her lap, and her lips pressed tight as if holding something back. Catherine felt her pulse quicken, though outwardly her smile didn't falter. She caught herself scanning the room for answers, and that's when she saw just a flicker of Charlotte walking past one of the open doors across the corridor. There was no sound of sobbing, no obvious tears, but her face told a different story. Pale, her mouth taut, her eyes betraying a quiet hurt that no child should have to hide. It wasn't the kind of hurt that came from a fall or a scraped knee. This was deeper, quieter, more insidious. Catherine's breath hitched. She excused herself mid-sentence, the words of her companion fading into the background as she stepped out of the circle of polite conversation. The corridor seemed longer than usual as she walked briskly, her heels muffled by the thick carpet, her thoughts already spiraling. What had happened in those few minutes she'd looked away? What had made Charlotte retreat into herself like that? As she approached the far end of the hallway, she saw her daughter standing alone near a service door, hands clasped tightly, staring down at the floor. The sight twisted something inside Catherine, a sharp ache of protectiveness, mingled with an anger she couldn't yet name. The little girl hadn't noticed her yet. So engrossed was she in her own quiet battle. "Sweetheart," Catherine called gently, crouching down to meet her at eye level. Charlotte looked up, startled at first, then quickly plastered on a small, unconvincing smile. "Nothing, Mommy," she said before Catherine could even ask. But Catherine wasn't fooled. Because in that moment, one thing became unshakably clear. Something had happened. Something that no royal protocol, no carefully choreographed event, and no veneer of family unity could hide from a mother's eyes. Catherine excused herself, not knowing she was about to uncover a quiet storm brewing in the corridors of Windsor Castle. Mothers know. Even when children say nothing's wrong, they always know. Catherine lowered herself to her daughter's level, her hands resting lightly on Charlotte's arms, her eyes searching for the truth Charlotte didn't want to say. The silence between them was thick, fragile, yet full of unspoken confessions. Catherine's voice softened, careful not to push too hard. "Sweetheart," she murmured, "tell me what happened." Charlotte's gaze darted away, her lips forming that same tight line as before. "Nothing," she whispered, but her tone betrayed her. Catherine held her stare a little longer, unwilling to look away until the silence cracked. Slowly, Charlotte exhaled and admitted what her mother had already suspected. "Granny Camilla said I was showing off," she confessed, her words barely audible. "She told me not to speak unless I was spoken to." The words struck Catherine like ice. They didn't shout insults. No, they were sharper for their quiet precision. That subtle jab disguised as etiquette, delivered with a practiced smile, had cut her daughter so deeply that she'd chosen to retreat into herself. Catherine blinked once, forcing herself to absorb the revelation without flinching. "When?" she asked gently. "When I was playing with Louis," Charlotte explained. "We were guessing things and I answered before he did. Then she said it." Catherine's mind raced. She hugged her daughter, holding her close, but inside, she felt an unfamiliar heat, rising anger laced with something more dangerous: clarity. As she stroked Charlotte's hair, her thoughts returned to the years she'd spent biting her tongue for the sake of royal harmony. She had tolerated the passive-aggressive remarks, the veiled criticisms, the constant, low hum of superiority Camilla carried with her. But she'd always assumed that it ended with her, that Camilla would never cross that invisible line and direct it at her children. Now she understood how wrong she had been. This wasn't just a single moment, Catherine began to recognize it for what it truly was, a pattern. A calculated dismissal of her daughter's confidence, disguised under the guise of tradition and discipline. She replayed Camilla's smiles, her tone, her cutting remarks she'd brushed aside over the years, and realized they'd added up to something far more corrosive than she had admitted to herself. Her eyes hardened, though her voice remained calm as she spoke to Charlotte. "You've done nothing wrong," she said firmly. But already her mind was shifting, her instincts on full alert. She had kept the peace for so long, sacrificed her own pride for the sake of appearances, but she could not allow the same to happen to her daughter. Not now, not ever. But what she learns next confirms her worst fears. One comment could be overlooked. Two, a pattern was emerging. Catherine stood just a few steps away from the refreshment table, her polite smile fixed in place as the chatter of the gathering swirled around her. But her eyes stayed on Charlotte, who had quietly reached for a second scone with an almost imperceptible glance toward her mother, as though silently asking permission. Catherine gave her a small nod, but before Charlotte could retreat, Camilla's voice sliced through the din, light, airy, but heavy with intent. "Perhaps one is enough, darling. We don't want to appear greedy." The words hung in the air, harmless on the surface but sharp in their delivery. Charlotte froze, her little fingers recoiling, and in that subtle, crushing moment, Catherine felt her stomach twist. She didn't speak yet, but inside, the outrage was already building. Watching her daughter quietly lower her hand and withdraw once more to her chair was enough to make Catherine's pulse hammer in her ears. For years, she had taught herself the art of patience. She had mastered the silent endurance required of her role. But now she could see clearly the method in Camilla's remarks, masked as etiquette but perfectly timed to shame. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in the way others might recognize, but it was deliberate. This wasn't about manners. This was about diminishing Charlotte. Catherine's eyes hardened as she connected it all, the guessing game earlier, the withdrawal, and now this. The whispers she had dismissed for so long came back to her, louder now. The little digs at her own expense over the years she'd chosen to ignore, convincing herself it was part of royal life. But this was not about her anymore. And what she saw in her daughter's downcast eyes told her she couldn't allow another moment like it. Charlotte, once chatty and confident even in the stiffest rooms, now sat with her shoulders slumped, her hands folded tight in her lap. Every flash of her expression screamed an internal struggle to stay composed, to endure. Catherine felt a pang so sharp it nearly stole her breath. This was not just a passing incident. It was a quiet unraveling. And with that realization, her resolve solidified. She could no longer justify silence. Camilla's calculated comments, however subtle, could not be allowed to continue unchecked. Not when they chipped away at her daughter's confidence with each passing hour. Catherine's outward calm remained, but within her, a quiet storm began to stir, one that would not be silenced this time. That evening at Adelaide Cottage, the calm exterior gives way to a quiet storm brewing within her heart. When a mother draws a line, even a queen must pay attention. Highgrove was meant to feel like a sanctuary, a rare reprieve from the relentless weight of royal appearances. Yet that evening, the air was thick with something unspoken, something neither the crackle of the fireplace nor the clinking of wine glasses could disguise. Catherine sat at the table with perfect composure, but every nerve in her body was alive, waiting. She watched Charlotte, who had come only to greet her grandfather before heading upstairs, stand politely near the fire with her small hands folded neatly in front of her. It was then, just when the room had begun to sink into the rhythm of shallow laughter and quiet conversation, that Camilla spoke. Her words slipped out like silk but carried the sting of a knife. "Are you sure you're not too tired to be here?" she asked Charlotte, her tone mild, almost amused. But to Catherine, the meaning was unmistakable. Another thinly veiled remark. Another dig. This time, in front of everyone. The silence that followed was deafening. Charlotte's polite smile faltered. Catherine's own mask of serenity hardened into something sharper. Calmly, she leaned toward her daughter and said, "Why don't you say goodnight to Grandpa and head upstairs with Anna?" Charlotte's eyes lifted to her mother, uncertain for a moment, but Catherine gave her a small nod of reassurance. The child obeyed, hugging her grandfather before disappearing through the door. Catherine's gaze never left Camilla. For years, she had absorbed these slights, letting them wash over her in silence to protect the fragile peace of the family. but now that silence cracked. As the door clicked shut, she rose to her feet and stepped forward, not loudly, not angrily, but with a presence so undeniable the room itself seemed to lean back. "She's not too sensitive," Catherine began, her voice level yet edged with steel. "She's a child, and she deserves to be spoken to with kindness." Camilla blinked, feigning surprise, though the faint smirk at the corner of her mouth betrayed her. "I didn't mean it that way," she replied. "I was just surprised she's still up at this hour. Hardly something to get upset about." Catherine's response cut clean through the charade. "It's not just tonight. It's been happening for weeks. I've heard what you've said to her, and so has she." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Camilla looked to William for rescue, but his silence spoke volumes. He leaned back in his chair, jaw tight, his eyes steady on his wife. For the first time in years, Catherine drew a boundary that no one dared cross. The room chilled, and though the conversation stumbled forward after that, everyone knew nothing would ever be the same again. But Catherine knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Balmoral loomed ahead, a place where tensions would either cool or ignite. The Scottish air at Balmoral was supposed to soothe, but this year it carried a quiet storm. Balmoral had always been Charles's haven, a sanctuary steeped in tradition and the faint scent of heather, where the family could breathe without cameras or crowds. But as Catherine arrived with William and their children, her heart was steeled. Balmoral might have promised peace, but she knew better than to trust its calm facade. This time, she would not leave Charlotte unguarded. Not for a moment. The carriages pulled up to the familiar steps, and the family disembarked to warm welcomes. Yet beneath the polite embraces, Catherine felt the chill of unspoken tension. Camilla arrived the next day, her demeanor perfectly composed, her words careful, her distance deliberate, but her silence spoke more than any confrontation. Since the Highgrove dinner, she had not directly addressed Catherine, and Catherine had no desire to break that silence. Still, the undercurrent between them wound through every room like an unspoken accusation neither of them cared to voice aloud. Everyone played their part. The family moved about the estate with practiced grace, smiling, laughing, pretending all was well. Meals were lively, conversations pleasant enough, and no one dared mention the shadow that still lingered from weeks earlier. But every so often, Catherine would catch Camilla's glance cool, measured, laced with something unspoken. Meanwhile, Charlotte began to reclaim herself in the Scottish countryside. She rose earlier each morning, bounding down to breakfast with her brothers, her cheeks flushed from the brisk air. Catherine watched her run through the fields, braid flowers into her hair, and even laugh again, fragile but genuine. Each day, Catherine allowed herself to hope that perhaps the worst had passed, that the warmth of Balmoral would melt away what lingered in her daughter's small shoulders. But she never let her guard down, not once. And when the time came for William to join Charles on a fishing excursion, Catherine stayed behind, resolute. The first few days passed quietly enough, long walks and late suppers filled with polite restraint. But then came the moment she'd dreaded. One of the staff leaned in discreetly and murmured, "I believe Princess Charlotte is in the sunroom with Her Majesty." Catherine's entire body stiffened as the words settled like stones in her chest. The soft light of Balmoral's sunroom had once felt like the warmest place in the castle, a corner of peace. But now it felt like the center of something inevitable. Her breath quickened as she rose without a word, her mind already bracing for what she might hear, for what she already suspected. And in that sunroom, beneath the soft light of Balmoral, everything came to a head. She heard the words before she saw the scene, and they cut deeper than she imagined. Catherine stopped just outside the sunroom, her footsteps halting at the faint sound of voices drifting through the partially open door. One was Charlotte's, soft and hesitant. The other, unmistakably, Camilla's, low and deliberate, each word wrapped in feigned patience, but dripping with quiet superiority. "We don't always need to speak over others, Charlotte," Camilla was saying, her tone sweetened just enough to pass as advice. "It's important to listen. Sometimes your mommy forgets that too." The sharpness of it stunned Catherine. She felt it pierce right through her composure, like a dagger aimed not only at her daughter but at her as well. For a fleeting second, she closed her eyes, steadying herself as the quiet fury rose in her chest. Then she stepped forward, no longer willing to remain in the shadows. As she entered, both Camilla and Charlotte turned. Camilla's expression faltered, not fear, not guilt, but surprise that Catherine had caught her mid-act. Catherine's gaze immediately sought Charlotte's, and the little girl's face spoke volumes. There it was again, that faint flinch of shame, as if she had done something wrong simply by existing. Catherine's voice broke the heavy silence, even and unshaken. "There you are," she said to Charlotte, her words calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I was looking for you, darling." Charlotte rose instantly and moved toward her mother, clinging to her side without a word. Camilla's smile returned, but it was brittle now, a facade cracking at the edges. "I was just having a word," she offered. But Catherine caught the faint edge beneath the words, a quiet insistence that she was still in control. But she wasn't. Catherine's eyes didn't leave hers. "I heard," she replied flatly. Camilla raised an eyebrow, as though inviting her to elaborate, but Catherine didn't flinch. "She was only being a child," she continued, her voice gaining strength with every syllable. "And she doesn't need to be corrected for that every time she speaks." Camilla straightened slightly, her arms crossing in a subtle defense. "I've raised children," she shot back, her tone still composed but edged now. "I know when a girl's growing too fast for her own good." "She's growing up just fine," Catherine answered, her words cutting through the room with quiet finality. "And she'll do so without being made to feel like a problem." For once, Camilla stayed silent. No clever retort. No dismissal. Nothing but the faint sound of the wind outside and the unmistakable shift of power between them. Catherine had drawn her line, steady and unyielding. And in that moment, Camilla's authority dimmed, muted by the clarity of a mother who refused to bend. But the palace was watching, and subtle changes began to ripple through the royal family's inner sanctum. Some battles are won without shouting, but their echoes linger in every room. After the Sunroom confrontation, Balmoral fell into a fragile quiet, where every smile seemed a little tighter, every laugh a little forced. Camilla, once so present and unbothered, began to keep her distance. Her words to Charlotte, and her glances too, became measured, calculated, stripped of the careless barbs she once allowed herself. Catherine's line had been drawn clearly, and Camilla, whether she liked it or not, could no longer pretend not to see it. William and Catherine moved through the castle with a quiet authority, one that didn't need to be announced. Together, they began to reshape the narrative from within, not with loud declarations but through deliberate presence. Wherever Charlotte went, Catherine's eyes followed, ensuring that even in the most informal moments, no one dared make her daughter feel small again. In their private quarters, Catherine and William spoke little of it, yet their unspoken agreement was clear. The old dynamics had been shattered, and they would not allow them to return. Even the staff began to notice. Aides exchanged knowing glances in corridors. Whispers rippled through the kitchens. Long accustomed to the invisible hierarchies and subtle power plays that defined royal life, they could sense that something fundamental had shifted. They saw how Camilla would pause now before addressing Charlotte, how she avoided letting her gaze linger too long, how she checked her words when Catherine was nearby. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was respect, hard-won and undeniable. Yet in public, the show went on. The photographers who came to Balmoral captured nothing but warmth. The family arranged on the steps, children laughing, arms linked, the perfect image of unity. Newspapers splashed their smiles across front pages as if nothing had changed. But those who lived inside the palace walls knew better. The smiles were still there, but the lines behind them had been redrawn, sharper now, with boundaries no one dared cross. Catherine didn't speak of it openly. She didn't need to. Every time she placed a protective hand on Charlotte's shoulder, every time she intervened before a moment could sour, she sent her message clearly. Appearances no longer came first. Her daughter's dignity was no longer negotiable. The summer ended, but the royal family would never be quite the same. Sometimes the most powerful statement is simply refusing to back down. Catherine never raised her voice, never demanded headlines, and never gave the palace an outright ultimatum, but the message was undeniable. Her quiet resolve began to shape the world around her in ways even she hadn't fully anticipated. When the time came for Charlotte's school recital, Catherine carefully chose the guest list herself. Camilla's name was conspicuously absent. The palace issued a gentle excuse, citing a scheduling conflict, but those who understood the nuances knew this was Catherine drawing her boundary with unshakable certainty. At the recital, Charlotte thrived, her laughter filling the room, her confidence finally returning without the shadow of disapproval looming over her. Catherine watched her daughter beam as she took her bow, knowing she had kept her promise. In every decision she made, Catherine was telling the world, and more importantly her family, that her daughter's dignity was no longer a matter of negotiation. Camilla, too, seemed to understand. Since Balmoral, her presence around Charlotte had diminished. She no longer sought to correct her in public, no longer fixed her with those sharp looks or let cutting remarks slip through. She kept a careful distance, offering only faint, formal smiles when their paths crossed. It was not an apology, nor was it warmth, but it was a retreat. And Catherine recognized it for what it was, a quiet surrender cloaked in civility. Even Charles, who had always sought to keep peace at any cost, adjusted to the new reality. His loyalty was torn, his affections divided between his wife and his daughter-in-law. But he no longer interfered. He no longer tried to excuse or soften Camilla's words. Instead, he began to stand aside, knowing Catherine's stand had been made not from pride, but from necessity. To the outside world, nothing appeared amiss. The press continued to gush about royal unity, publishing radiant photographs of the family, smiling at charity events and waving to crowds as if nothing had shifted. But within the palace walls, everything had changed. The invisible hierarchy that had quietly punished the youngest among them had been broken, replaced by something stronger, a mother's determination to protect her child at any cost. Catherine never claimed a victory aloud. She didn't need to. The way Charlotte walked into rooms again with her chin a little higher and her voice a little stronger was proof enough. Every deliberate step Catherine took, every quiet decision to shield her daughter, was her triumph. Yet even as the dust settled, Catherine knew the next chapter still waited to unfold. Behind every royal smile is a story the cameras will never tell. To the world, Catherine remained the picture of grace, radiant at events, steadfast at her husband's side, her children impeccably dressed and perfectly behaved. But within those walls, hidden from the flash of photographers, her quiet fight had reshaped everything. Balancing the crushing weight of duty with the fierce instinct to protect her daughter, she had done what many before her could not. She had defied centuries of hierarchy without toppling the crown. And she had done it without shouting, without scandal, just a mother's unwavering resolve. Charlotte, once shrinking into silence, began to bloom again. It wasn't immediate, but day by day, she found her spark returning. At family dinners, she spoke up, her eyes brighter, her laugh fuller. The girl who once hesitated to reach for another scone now stood confidently beside her brothers, her head held high even under the scrutiny of palace eyes. Catherine watched her daughter flourish and knew the cost of her stand had been worth every quiet, tense moment that followed. Even Camilla, though she would never admit it outright, had begun to show a grudging respect for the woman she once dismissed as delicate. Their interactions were colder now, but Catherine noticed the shift. Camilla measured her words carefully when Charlotte was near, and the casual superiority she once carried seemed dulled in Catherine's presence. Perhaps it was not friendship that grew between them, but something else, an acknowledgement that Catherine had claimed a space no one would dare to strip from her. For the cameras, the family unity remained intact. Photographs of royal holidays and charity events painted the familiar picture of harmony. The world continued to see what it wanted to see, the perfect family. But those who knew, who lived inside the palace, felt the unspoken truth. Catherine's quiet defiance had recalibrated the unyielding dynamics of the house. Her example lingered in those halls, proof that even in an institution built on silence and submission, a mother's love could redraw the lines. She had shown that kindness could be demanded, that dignity was not a privilege but a right, even in a palace. In doing so, she left not just her daughter, but the entire family with a new understanding of what respect truly meant. And so, behind the palace walls, one mother's love left an indelible mark, ensuring her daughter would never feel small again. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.